Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar on Daryl Siedentop, who is one of the greatest names in the fields of physical education and teacher education. My name is Fatih Dervent. I'm a professor at Physical Education Teacher Education Department at Marmara University in Istanbul. I will be moderating the webinar today. We plan to have a 45 minutes question section, which I will be presenting questions to our presenter. And then we plan to have a 15 minutes Q&A section in the very end. Today's webinar is brought to you by Physical Education Teacher Association of Türkiye, which I will be referring to as TÜBET from that point on. TÜBET is one of the oldest non-governmental, non-profit organizations nationwide, founded in 1953. TÜBET identifies itself as the professional development platform for physical education teachers who values professional development as a professional and moral responsibility. Conducting professional development workshops and community of practices for practicing and pre-service physical education teachers, publishing a blind review, the annual scientific journal named Journal of Physical Education and Sports Studies, recognizing physical education teachers who promote both excellence and advocacy for the profession with the Excellence in Teaching Physical Education Award, and as well as webinars such as today's session are among primary activities of TÜBET. Today's webinar is about Daryl Siedentop, who has been recognized as the most influential scholars in the fields of physical education and teacher education. In addition to his researches and seminal work, his practical contribution is so significant in our field. Sport education model rooted in game theory has been used many physical education teachers worldwide. And sports education instructional model is the most preferred instructional model among PE teachers in Turkey as well. Siedentop's legacy and influence have been spread by his doctoral students, as almost all of them are regarded as distinguished scholars in our field. Today, I have the pleasure to have one of Daryl's doctoral students as our presenter, Professor Phillip Ward. He's a professor at Pitt Department of Human Sciences at the Ohio State University. His research has been defined by a series of research programs focused on instructional interventions designed to improve teaching quality and teaching effectiveness. He's the director of Learning to Teach Physical Education program that has its central focus as the development of content knowledge for teaching PE. The program is multi-methodological and multi-institutional teams across the United States, Belgium, China, Japan, Israel, Korea, and as well as Turkey. He is the co-author and author of 5 books. He has served as an invited speaker at Leuven University in Belgium, East China Normal University, Hong Kong Institute of Education, Nippon Sports University in Japan, and Zenon College in Israel. He has delivered keynote speeches in different countries from different continents. And today he's with us to share his experience about Daryl Siedentop. Welcome to our webinar, Professor Dr. Ward.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction, Fatih. I'm honored to be able to talk about Daryl Siedentop. There are many others, I think, who could sit here and do this chat, but I'm just absolutely delighted that I can get to do this. The webinar was occasioned by a paper co-authored by myself and Sherry Vizio and Peter Elizabeth, and I want to acknowledge their contributions to that paper, but also indirectly to this webinar. I also want to draw attention to the recent Quest issue that came out in their first edition this year, I think, co-edited by Sherry and Tristan Wallhead, that has a number of articles about Daryl. When I look at those articles, what strikes me is that they represent a pretty good case study of what it means to be a scholar, a mentor, a teacher, educator, and to use a very hip or perhaps more modern term, an influencer. With that, I'll hand back to you for questions, Fatih.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. Thank you for coming. We are really feel privileged to have you here. So my first question is, how do you know Daryl Siedentop? Can you just give us some?
I first came across Daryl Siedentop from his graduate student, Ken Alexander, who had me for a master's degree in Australia. And I went to Ohio State in 1990. He was my advisor. He moved to quickly being a mentor and a friend. And I also came to know Daryl through my relationship with his wife, Bobby, and Bobby through Daryl. So I've known Daryl, as most of his students have, in a multitude of different roles.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great start. And I wonder, because as I read your paper and we all know that Daryl Siedentop is a behavior analyst. And what does that mean? What does that mean to be a behavior analyst?
Yeah, I thought about how I would present this. I think behavior analysis looks different than a lot of other theories and sciences out there. One way it is significantly different than many other, not all, but many other theories, is it's not a work theory that you can leave the office and leave behind and go home and come back to it the next day. It's a pretty, science is almost always a belief system, and as such, it is a belief system that carries through one's life. There's seldom a resort to other theories for explanation. The power of the analysis of behavior analysis is pretty clear. It doesn't answer all questions. It doesn't have access to a lot of the histories of individuals to be able to help them, but it does offer many solutions to sort of educational and life issues in general. It's a natural science, and the best way to think of it is it's not a standalone approach to the world. It's preceded, its root science is biology, and its cultural science is cultural materialism, mostly the work of Marvin Harris. From a biological perspective, or rather from all of these three perspectives, they're selectionist science, which means that behavior or genes or cultural behavior are selected by an environment. That environment occurs within and outside the skin. In today's terms, it would be an ecological theory. In that sense, it's grounded in behaviorism, the work of B.F. Skinner. He's mostly the person who's written on the philosophy work. There are a bunch of other philosophers out there in this work, and behavior analysis has a great deal of research in a number of different researchers in a great number of areas. It's a tenet of behavior analysis that behavior that we see now, which in its simplest form might be what you say or think or do or write, is a function of the history that people have had and a function of the behaviors they've just been engaging in and the current context that they're dealing with. The way behavior analysis deals with this is that it views everyone as a unique individual, like a snowflake coming down to the earth. The snowflake is shaped, it's on its journey into different shapes, and it doesn't quite look like anybody else, even though the forces that shaped it are more similar than different. So behavior analysis views that individuals are pretty much shaped by their history, experiences, if you like, that they have, and by what's currently operating where they're living, and the conditions that influence them at that point in time. It's not true to say it's an environment that stops at the skin. It takes into account thinking, but the larger question for behavior analysis is what caused the thinking to begin with? And almost always they're going to be able to trace that back to some degree to environmental influences on that, or previous thinking that was occasioned by some other environmental influence. So it's often misunderstood. It's viewed as a one size fits all approach to things, but the snowflake example pretty much I guess counters that position. It's viewed as a positivist science, but neither Daryl nor behavior analysis is a positivistic science in any way. Logical positivism is commonly associated with other forms of behaviorism, such as methodological behaviorism. There are probably about 14 or so different versions of behaviorism. Behavior analysis is a specific science from radical behaviorism. The root theorist of that was B.F. Skinner. Mostly today, the terms that are in popularity in the zeitgeist for research fit behavior analysis. It's evidence-based. It has a lot in common with ethnography. It goes into settings and tries to figure out what's going on, what are the behaviors that are occurring, what might be assumptions about why they're occurring, and then it typically uses experimentation in various ways to put some of them to the test to see if they are the causes of the behavior that you're looking at. I think one of the things about Daryl and behavior analysis that is so important is the teaching effectiveness research that's been done in our field, in fact, in any of the fields for the most part, was discovered from teachers by observing teachers, what teachers did. It wasn't an invented knowledge. Some of it is, but for the most part, everyone observed teachers. They may not have been behavior analysts that were doing the observational, but if you go back to the process product literature, those were almost exclusively observational studies, and they have a lot in common with behavioral approaches to understanding what's going on in a particular setting.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. So I really appreciate the snowflake metaphor. That's very enlightening. So you told us that Daryl Siedentop is behavior analyst. Are there any other behavior analysts in our field?
You know, there are a number, Eitan Eldar and Shiria Vizio in Israel, and Hans van der Maas, Tom McKenzie, myself in the USA, Peter Isbeth in Belgium, Gary Martin and the late Brent Rushall in sports psychology. And there are a huge number of people who use behavioral methodologies and positioning, such as yourself and a lot of your colleagues in Turkey do. So it's not as small a world and as one might think, but it does represent a smaller part of the larger field of educational research these days.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. So let's talk about how Daryl became a behavior analyst, because there must be something that he just followed this path in his life.
Yeah, about I don't know, about a year ago or so, just shortly before Brent Rushall passed away, I had the really good fortune to talk to Brent. As an Australian, he and I had literally never crossed paths before, and we spent a couple of hours chatting, and it was really cool. Daryl did his PhD at Indiana University. Brent Rushall was about a year ahead. Well, sort of a year ahead of him, although I think they graduated at the same time. Brent was a behavior analyst, and when Daryl encountered Brent, he very quickly thought this was an interesting guy, and he thought, what he's talking about made a lot of sense to him. And so Brent and Daryl became sort of a twosome at Indiana and were the behavior analysts. In fact, during their time at Indiana, they were quite a troublesome pair. Daryl's advisor told Daryl and Brent on the day that Daryl was going to give his defend his dissertation, that neither of them were to cause trouble, and it was meant to be a smooth delivery of the dissertation defense, and of course that didn't happen. But following graduation, they stayed in contact. They wrote their book together, The Development and Control of Behavior in Sport and Physical Education. I think that was published around 72. Brent went to Canada at the time and actually advised Tom McKenzie at that point, and Daryl got his job at Ohio State. And when Daryl came to Ohio State, he had a whole group of people around him who were behavioral in nature. John Cooper, Tim Heron, Bill Heward, their graduate students, the doctoral programs that were there. And he had graduate students who sort of, as I'll talk about in a little bit, sort of enriched his world. In addition, he had a group of colleagues who accumulated over the years. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but you have Mary O'Sullivan, Deborah Tannehill, Sandy Strout, a host of folks who stayed on as visiting professors. And as a result, those folks became sort of challenges, critiques of his view, but also supported his work in that area. So he had a fairly enriched environment. He had undergraduate, graduate students in particular who did behavior analysis. He also came into contact. He had a wide group of people outside the field who were not behavior analysts for the most part, but they helped shape and define his behavior in that area. So he was able to present his view to a large number of people, and that was, as they would say in the behavioral community, very reinforcing for him.
Thank you. So let's go on with your paper, which was recently published on Quest, on a special edition on Daryl Siedentop, because you were talking about Daryl has a research lens. So what do you mean by that, and what was his lens?
Yeah, the interesting thing about Daryl is that he was clearly a behavior analyst, and there are some folks who have suggested he sort of strayed a little bit, but in actual fact, he was always a behavior analyst, but he always read widely outside his field, and he tended to behavioralize things, other theories that he saw, and he always looked at what these other positions could present, sometimes so he could define his own position, but other times so he could learn from them and basically behavioralize what those theories said. He talked about this a lot, about getting out of your own paradigmatic space, but to do so without leaving your own paradigm behind. He gave a good example of that with Walter Doyle's work at Arizona, where he read Doyle and he thought Doyle was, talking about something differently. And the further he got into it, the clearer it became that Doyle was not a behavior analyst at all, but Daryl could apply behavior analytic principles and procedures to what Doyle was talking about. And that began his work in the task systems literature. This behavioralizing of research traditions was a common theme for Daryl, and many people in the Quest issues talked about the fact that Daryl read widely outside his field, and I think that was an important characteristic of his lens. It wasn't a narrow focus. He also had a very broad focus, not in the sense of the way he looked at the problems, but he started off very much on research on teaching and focused on teaching effectiveness literature. And later on in his career, he talked a lot more specifically about physical activity. And when he became a dean at Ohio State, Hal Lawson reminded me this morning, he was very interested in social injustices and social changes that were occurring for the poor and disenfranchised in education. So he had a pretty broad perspective, and that, even though he was interested in those things all along, at different stages in his career, he tended to emphasize, because of the opportunities he was presented with, more interest in those areas versus others. His research methodology was always focusing on direct observation of things. If questionnaires or interviews were used, they typically informed him about how to look at it from an observational perspective in the next series of work he did. His work was programmatic. He believed in replication on research studies and doing it in a systematic way. And if you look at the ALT research, the task systems research he did, that pretty much epitomizes what his approach to research was. He looked at, and a lot of his graduate students helped, or rather influenced him in this area, increasingly multi-dimensional measures of what was happening, pretty much like if you go to hospital, the doctor just doesn't take your blood pressure. They might take your blood work and a bunch of other other approaches. As he moved through his career, more and more instruments were used to assess variables at the same time. These were supplemented by interviews, surveys, all of this with the goal of trying to get a bit of a better picture about what was going on in the setting. He, from a behavioral point of view, when direct observation was used, he focused pretty exclusively on the typical behavioral strategies, at capturing as much of what was going on in the setting as possible for as long as it was occurring. Sometimes this was sampling some of it, but typically sampling it across the entire lesson or a unit of instruction. He looked pretty much for variations in behavior and the causes for those variations. And he, like most behavior analysts, he was interested in social significance, improving the setting that he was looking at.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. Before going on our last question, let me remind our viewers that they can ask questions using the comment section on YouTube, so I can ask those questions to you. Okay, my last question for this webinar to you is, so far we have talked about Daryl. Thank you for sharing your experience with him. So in the end, can you talk about some of Daryl's impact in the field of physical education? What he has changed in our field?
I think Daryl's impact was fairly widespread. One of the things about Daryl is he was quite happy to prosecute his view as a behavior analyst, but a lot of the work he didn't talk about behavior analysis a lot. You won't find behavior analysis reported in sport education, but a great deal of what occurs in sport education is behavior analytic. There are antecedents and consequences all over it. There are specific behaviors. They're just not called those things. They're called accountability. They're called social behaviors, instructional behaviors, various forms of student behaviors, but it's all behavioral. The same too in his Developing Teaching Skills in Physical Education book. I don't know if the word behavior analysis appears anywhere in that book, but much of that work is driven by his belief about behavior analysis. It's not a primary influence on the content, but how that was presented, how it was organized, I think is important to understand. And Daryl was very good at just getting people to sort of connect with the literature in ways that didn't sort of put them off. Because one of the problems about behavior analysis that I've always found is if Skinner had not been at Harvard in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but had been Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, we would have had a lot more hip language than we do in the behavior analytic field now. But we don't, and so we have a bit of a presentism problem when people interpret behavior analysis from time to time, and we pretty much stick with the labels that Skinner created back then. So Daryl's contribution, lots of ways of looking at it. From the physical education perspective, he was pretty clear about what the content of the field was. It was first and foremost movement and the knowledge that would support that. His position was that almost every other domain should support the role of movement. That is, students move, and the knowledge that they need to move and the reasons why they need to move are all important, but they're not independent of the essential position that our subject matter is about movement. He'd written a couple of papers on this. It's 2002 paper, which actually came from his 89 keynote address in AFID at the time, talked about this, where he pretty much laid that out, and he did so at the same time as making the case for what should be the content of a teacher education program. At the time, there was a significant debate in the academy about what the knowledge bases should be for teaching physical education teachers. It began with Franklin Hendry's paper, but it certainly continued on with the work of Carl Newell and a number of others in the field. His position was that the content of teacher education needs to focus primarily on what is taught, what teachers need to know to teach children in schools, children and youth in schools. That primarily includes pedagogy, content knowledge, some social aspects, socialization aspects, psychology. But his position on all of this was that that needed to be content that was directly related to what teachers needed to know. And so issues such as spending a lot of time on exercise science, or a great deal of work on learning sort of the etiology of different issues, not as important to him as teaching what teachers needed to know to teach. Lots of debates about that over the years with people, and he acknowledged that in his writings. But his focus on content knowledge at teacher education and in physical education was a big contribution. I think in teacher education, his contribution in supervision, Nikki Tangaridou, the lead author on a paper in the special issue, and the Metzler et al. Paper, talk about supervision and his role in that area. Ohio State was one of the early places where supervision was studied as a research topic. It occurred elsewhere, but there was a good amount done at Ohio State. His work of academic learning time, originally initiated by Mike Metzler, and which Daryl embraced very quickly, drove the academic learning time physical education programs. This provided some very good indicators on how researchers and teachers could think about how a lesson was organized and where to place priorities on lesson, and the very influential impact on how much time students have to learn based on what the teacher does and what the students do in classes. That has influenced countless generations of folks around the world. And I think that's a particularly important area. I think his work on task systems, the ecological perspective, that there are social, managerial, transitional, and instructional dimensions to a class, that they all interact in an environment and and therefore they influence each other, was a really important contribution to the way we thought about how classrooms are organized. He was heavily influenced by Walter Doyle in that work, others as well, but mostly Doyle. That I think is, I don't know, when I look at that work, I often think that it's been underestimated by the community, even though it underscored, I guess, a lot of work that's been done. His work on the curriculum instructional model in sport education that Hans van der Maas, Peter Hasty have embraced as co-authors in his book and continue that tradition on. That had its work grounded in his play education work at Indiana, but I think the book is in its third iteration right now, and it represents a very well thought out curriculum and instructional model that's used around the world. And I've traveled to places like China and Japan and seen it being used in ways that are just that would just make everyone very happy that it was being used that way. Curriculums are always difficult to sort of implement and maintain. I think there are some other areas where Daryl has influenced his work on physical activity, and I think that work is important. Again, his conceptualization of the role of physical activity and movement was important. He believed, I mean, in its simplest form, I suspect that it would be very difficult to have physical activity if you weren't moving. So he saw them as complementary, I think, and physical activity as a natural outcome of of movement-based physical education content. Not the only perspective he had. He also had perspectives on social development of students and pretty much focused in that area. When he was dean, he focused on a lot of work, such as in a professional education, as I mentioned earlier. His work, he invited Hal Lawson to Ohio State to talk about poverty and social exclusion. He had a fairly broad perspective. I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of things that he did, but his influence was global and programmatic in the way it was presented to folks.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. So there we have a couple of questions coming from experienced scholars, initial PE teachers, and some young scholars, which I am happy. So the first question is coming from Hans van der Maas, and he just wants you to speak a bit about Daryl Siedentop's views on content knowledge, which you already made a couple of comments on it, but can you please elaborate his views on content knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, Daryl was the kind of professor who didn't just teach a theory class. He taught basketball and badminton when he was at Ohio State. He believed that content knowledge was like one of the core. Well, I mean, sounds pedantic to say this, but he believed it was one of the core things that teachers needed to know, and because of that, he thought it was so important that professors be involved in teaching that content. That was a belief held by many of the faculty at Ohio State. So I think that he wanted to make sure that students got a good grounding in content knowledge, and he wanted to make sure, he believed that the best way to go about that was to learn the content knowledge and experience the content, the instruction and the instructional dimensions of content knowledge, and of the content that rather students were to teach in schools. So I think Daryl's, I think that and my previous comments pretty much define. I feel like I'm missing something really obvious here, but yes, I think content knowledge was a core belief of Daryl.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. This question is coming from a first-year PE teacher. He wants to know any tips for a teacher who is starting out and considering using sport education model in his classes. So can you give some tips to him? Because he wants to know.
Well, I will just echo what's from the book. Start small and add as you go. So, putting students in teams, having affiliation, keeping them in the same groups for the duration of the unit, having longer units, something that everybody that I know for the most part has been arguing for a long time, but not many teachers have actually gone beyond about 10-day units. But it turns out the longer the units, the more you can get done, the more skillful students can become, the better their social interactions and so on. But to get in sport education, just take it slow. As I said, putting them in teams, initially perhaps doing the instruction as the teacher before you have the various roles that are introduced in sport ed, then introducing the roles not all at once, perhaps incrementally, having tournaments, competitions each day, so that mini games, so that the students can experience competition, making sure at the end that it's fair, mostly in terms of the selection of students, holding students accountable for the wins or losses, the cooperation, whatever it is that are the objectives of the unit, holding them accountable for skills, and then getting to a point where the captains and coaches can do the work after talking to the teacher, and having more sophisticated game plays where students are talking in huddling about what strategies or what tactics they might be using. I think that's pretty well laid out in the sport education book, and my advice would be grab that book and just start somewhere and implement it slowly, but keep adding as you go.
Thanks for the tips, Dr. Ward. So this question is coming from Dennis Hunigan. She wants to know Daryl's impact on graduate program at the Ohio State University.
How he arranged the graduate program?
So how he arranged, and because we know many graduates from this program just made a great impact. So let's say expand his legacy and impact by his doctoral students. We know that. So maybe we can talk about this impact, how it's extended by those students, and how he just designed the program to have this greater impact.
Sure. Well, I think most people will say Daryl was a really smart guy. And one of the things that he was really smart about is bringing smart people around him. And a lot of the things that went on at Ohio State were driven by Daryl, but they were also driven by his colleagues who were there. And as a group, this produced a culture. And it was a culture of openness. It was a culture of learning. It was an inquiry. It was a culture of not putting barriers on what students could learn. It was a culture of allowing students to chart their own path if they wanted to. It was a culture of respecting different approaches and views. It was a culture of being grounded pretty much in the practice of teaching and the practice of teacher education. What is called today practice-based teacher education, which has become a term to define a focus on the act of teaching. Daryl and Mary and Sandy and Deborah and a whole bunch of other folks there were doing that in the 80s, as other programs were around the country. But it was very much focused on the act of teaching and what you needed to know to be a good teacher. And that was what was taught in teacher education. I think if you're a graduate student at Ohio State, you experience that through the apprenticeship model, the socialization effort there. I think if you were a graduate student there, you studied the classes, the theoretical classes that underpinned that. In fact, if there was a focus, a primary distinction today between doctoral study, at least in the USA, and what happened back in the day at Ohio State and other universities, it is that a lot of the theory, a lot of the research that underpinned the practice of teaching and physical education was being studied, rather than necessarily specific theories say motivation or whatever, not to decry, not to be prejudiced towards motivation, but it was very much focused on the practice of teaching and what were the rationales behind why we do supervision, what are the rationales behind whether we should do early field experiences or late field experiences, how we should acclimate students to teaching, what would today be called social, well, was called back then socialization. That was a core amount of what doctoral students studied, but there was also the most powerful influence, I think, of that culture was what we called our doctoral seminar, where graduate students would sit around the table with faculty. We would collectively study the same topic, often driven by some interests of a faculty member or something that had just recently occasion that everyone wanted to sort of get into. And whether or not it was books or a series of articles, whatever it might be, we were able to collectively sit around and we could see how different faculty perceived a problem, how they disagreed with each other, how they agreed with each other, how they opened the door for graduate students to have positions, how they supported those positions, and also at times challenged those positions. I thought that was, as I would say, the best thing since sliced cheese. Of all the things that happened in graduate school, that doctoral seminar was just a very special thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. As a visiting scholar who spent 2 years at the Ohio State University, I really experienced this openness and this collective work between faculty and the graduate students. I also experienced the same thing. Thank you very much for explaining it. Let's go on. And another question from Wanderma. So he asked you to explain the hot seat course. I think it's related with the graduate program. So we just wanted to hear about it.
Yes, well, I arrived in 1990 and the hot seat stopped, I think, that year. But the hot seat course, as I understand it, I think Charlie Mand and Daryl, I may not have all my facts right here, but I think Charlie and Daryl ran the hot seat, and basically students were expected to know a paper or two really well, and they were put on the seat and everyone would ask them questions about the paper or theory or whatever it was that was the topic, and all the graduate students had to go through that. But sadly, well, at least for me, because I was kind of looking forward to it, but it was over by 1990 when I got there. There are pros and cons of doing it, but I never got to experience the hot seat except when Daryl was put on the hot seat when he retired. There was a simulated hot seat where he sat out front and folks asked questions and whatnot.
Thank you for the answer, and this is an inspiration for me to use at my graduate classes. Thank you very much. Let's go on with a question from Ferman Konukman from Doha, Qatar. So he asks this question: considering the child obesity in the world, definition of our field as physical education, physical activity education, and exercise education, how applied behavior analysts will shape our field in the future?
I don't know the answer to that question. It's not true to say that there are more behavior analysts in our field each year. In actual fact, there are fewer. There are a lot of people who use behavior analysis. A lot of them actually don't know they're using behavior analysis. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. When B.F. Skinner was asked that question about behavior analysis, he did not give a hopeful answer to that. I'm not sure if this is simply because there are very few places where people are trained in behavior analysis now. That's certainly one reason why there are fewer behavior analysts out there. But it also, I think, is reflective of Thomas Kuhn's sort of paradigmatic revolutions. Things sort of evolve over time. So I don't know if behavior analysis is going to play as big an impact as I sure hope I would like to have seen it do. I think it has in some areas. You only have to look at the work of Tom McKenzie and Spark. That was entirely grounded in behavior analysis, and represents one of the major and most successful curriculum approaches for physical activity and physical education in the world. And it continues and grows. I just don't know if there are other movements quite as powerful as that out there. But I think the work that I'm doing in the area of pedagogical content knowledge, adaptive teaching, that's behavior analytic, and it's fairly sizable in its impact. I'm just not sure that we have a lot of other behavior analysts following behind right now. So I don't know if I have a good answer to that.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. So we have some viewers, by the way, who was in the hot seat during the graduate study here. Thank you for the heads up. So I hope I don't miss any questions, because comments and questions are coming up. So if I miss your questions, please rewrite it again on the comments so I can clearly see it. Can you just give us the most memorable experience, let's say memory, that you had with Daryl? Maybe as a student and teacher relationships, or maybe as friends?
I shared this story at Daryl's memorial. There were a bunch of us at the time, Ben Dyson, Nikki Tangaridu, Penny Otis Dudas, and a couple of others I can't remember. And our plane had been delayed in 1990, and we were heading back that night to take a class on single subject research. And we got on the plane, and Daryl, I can't remember. I think it was Bobby who did this. Certainly Deborah and Mary were on the plane, and Sandy, I think. And so I suspect it was a bit of a collaborative effort before it started. But suddenly we knew that Bobby came back, and we were going to be late back to our class on single subject research design. And Bobby came back and said, "Nope, we're going to hold the class on the plane." And she said, Daryl's going to come up and see Daryl, who'll give you a research question, and you need to think about it. And each one of us went up one at a time, and Daryl would give us these bizarre questions that had nothing to do with the class, like, what is a type 5 error in research, or I can't think of anything else. But people would come back, and they would be like, their faces would be drawn, and they would go, "What? I don't know. That wasn't in the stuff that we read this week. I don't understand why we got this question." And after a few of them had come back, we started to catch on that we were having our legs pulled. But that was a very humorous situation for us. And for all of us, it was our first semester at Ohio State. And it taught us that Daryl had a really good sense of humor. And it was funny. It also taught us not to trust everybody who was at Ohio State, because they did pull our legs from time to time. But that's one of my favorite experiences of Daryl. There have been some other more personal experiences, but I won't sort of share those. I think.
Thank you, Bobby. She is here as well, and she says, "Oh, those were the days." Yeah, thank you, Bobby. So we have our last 10 minutes. So I wanted to know, do you remember the time that you explained specialized content knowledge to Daryl? Do you remember how it was and how you felt about it?
Daryl and I had a couple of really longer conversations, which was odd, because most conversations with Daryl weren't that long. It took me 50 minutes to explain to him what I was talking about. I was just very poor at explaining it in those days. And at the end of it, he just went, "Yeah, he agreed and said, that was some of the stuff that he was trying to do when he was, teaching basketball and badminton." But he also pointed out he hadn't sort of explained it. That work is derived pretty much from Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan. And she did a good job at categorizing that, but I just didn't explain it to him very well at all. And now I can explain it much quicker and much easier. And so probably his confusion was more my inability to explain, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. I think it's time to wrap up if we don't have any additional questions. So before we close this webinar, do you have some last words to share with our viewers?
You know, I said at the start that I think that special issue in Quest is a real example of when you read it, you hear the love that people had for Daryl, the respect that they had for him, and how it's a real case study of what it means to be a scholar and a researcher and a mentor to folks. When I think of Daryl, what I most think of is the fact that he didn't put limits on people who worked with him. He allowed people to grow and develop in the different directions that they went, even if they weren't directions that he was particularly interested in. And he also allowed himself to be influenced by people who had come from different perspectives than he did. That's a rare thing, and it just represents a lesson, I think, that we don't see enough these days. There are just simply too few people in physical education, teacher education, and in our research field that we really shouldn't be strangers. And Daryl was very much someone who wanted to bring people in, not push people apart.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. Thank you. That was a great time to spend time with you and your experience with Daryl. So we learned many things from him and his students, and we appreciate his contribution to our field. I hope everyone enjoys our webinar. This record will be available anytime on YouTube channel of TÜBET. And for those from Turkey, and subtitles will be available in a couple of days. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.